Good morning, Shabbat Shalom. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, and this is Valley Beth Shalom online, and welcome to Shabbat morning Torah study. My colleagues, Rabbi Gelman and Rabbi Hirsch, are not with us this morning. Rabbi Gelman is moving to Florida, and we wish his family a very good move, efficient move, and hopefully it's a wonderful new setting for his life and career. And Rabbi Hirsch is taking some very well-deserved vacation time with her family, so I'll be by myself this morning. But I want to wish you a very, very good Shabbos. This morning, we opened the Torah to a double Torah portion, Chukat and Balak. And what's strange is that these two portions, they form a sort of seam line. Chukat is the last section of a long tale that we've been telling, and Balak is actually the first of a new tale that we're about to enter into. So let's first take a look at the Chukat Parsha, then the Balak Parsha, and then a few words together about the 4th of July. We've talked before about the purpose of the book of Bamidbar. In some ways, the book of Bamidbar is superfluous. It doesn't need to be in the Torah. God takes us out of Egypt. We cross the Sinai Desert. Across the Red Sea, we cross the Sinai Desert. We arrive at Mount Sinai. And there, the people of Israel form a covenant with God. And they receive the commandments. First the 10 commandments, then the rest of the commandments of the Torah. And then what should happen next is that it's a very short journey, geographically and physically, from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land. And that's where the book of Bamidbar fits in. Because while it's a very short journey geographically, morally it's a very, very long trek. Because the task here is not simply to get the people of Israel physically from Egypt to Sinai to the Promised Land. The task is to liberate the heart of this people, to liberate their souls, to get them to see themselves and their world differently, to get them to attach themselves to the task of creating the just society and the sacred personality. But that's not an easy task. It's much easier to take the people Israel out of Egypt than to take the Egypt out of the people Israel. They are stubbornly human, stubbornly slaves to so many of the predilections and idiosyncrasies of being human that it makes it very hard for us to imagine them as a covenanted people. And that's the purpose, that's the burden, that's the task of the book of Bamidbar. Now, we've talked about this before. Every book of the Bible gets its name from the first significant word in the very first line. And the book of Bamidbar starts, Bamidbar Sinai, in the wilderness of Sinai. But the title means so much more. Bamidbar means in the wilderness. And this is a book about the wilderness of the human soul, the wilderness of the human condition. I like to imagine this book as a loving message from an old and experienced and wise idealist to his young colleagues. And he says to his young colleagues, I respect you. I cherish your idealism. I cherish your revolutionary zeal. I cherish your desire to remake the world, to remake society, to heal the ills that plague our society. I respect that. But you have to know the human material out of which you are building your utopia. You have to understand what human beings are like, what they're made of. Because if you don't, if you think that solely on the basis of your enthusiasm, your zeal, your passion for justice, human beings are going to suddenly improve and change, that's not the way human beings are. And the old idealist says to the young one, I don't want you to become disillusioned like so many of my generation did. I don't want you to become dispirited. I don't want you to become depressed. I don't want you to despair. I want you to know what you're getting going in, because that way I might inoculate you against the despair. Because there's nothing more pathetic than an idealist who has been dispirited and disillusioned. They become so bitter and so angry. And so the old idealist says, let me tell you a story of the slog through the wilderness. To get from Sinai, which is the vision of the sacred personality and the just society, to get from the vision to the reality of the Promised Land, You have to cross the wilderness. It's the wilderness of the human condition. And so what we have in these first chapters, fundamentally from chapter 11 of the book of Bamidbar, of Numbers, to about chapter 22, is in fact this journey through the wilderness of the human condition. And we meet all of the dark sides of the human character. We meet human impulsiveness, human desire, human covetousness. When Moses offers his people the word of God, they complain there isn't enough meat, there isn't enough water. They want a different way of material life. That's what matters most. When he brings them to the boundaries of the promised land and sends 12 spies, 12 scouts to go and to see the land, they come back with a dispiriting report. We'll never own this land. It'll never be ours. We aren't capable. We aren't deserving. We aren't worthy of seeing the fulfillment of the promise given to our ancestors. And then everyone betrays Moses. He's betrayed by his people. He's betrayed by his tribe. His cousin Korach leads a rebellion of the priests. He's betrayed by the people, Datan and Abiram, out of their greed and covetousness for Moses' power and authority, rebel against him. The 250 chieftains, the leaders of the tribe, rebel against him. He's betrayed by his own family, by Miriam and Aaron, who whisper and gossip against his wife. You think you're not the only Jewish family where sisters-in-law are a problem. And then eventually, as we'll see in today's Torah portion, he's betrayed by God. And yet, the great story of the book of Bamidbar is his resilience, his ability to move forward, his resignation to the limits of his own abilities, and his realism, and his willingness to just move the task forward, even if I can't be the one to see its fulfillment. In today's Torah portion, we reach the climax of this tour of the dark side, the climax of this exploration of the limitations of human morality, the limitations of the human heart, the limitations of human conscience, the limitations of the human being. And today, the topic is not going to be what we've had before. Before we had fear and covetousness, greed, and a desire to be in charge, and impulsive desires that distract us from the sacred work ahead. Today, in some ways, is the most vicious blow. Today, we're going to talk about, death. It's about dying. What is the ultimate betrayal of the human condition? We will die before we see the promised land. Now, the Torah portion, I'm going to deal with it sort of backwards. Let's begin in chapter 20. In chapter 20, the two people closest to Moses, his sister Miriam and his brother Aaron, they're going to die. The two people who were with him from the very beginning, the sister who protected him as an infant, the brother who's been his spokesman since the beginning, since the time they confronted Pharaoh, the two who have been with him and stood with him and cared for him, they're both going to die. And then as he's dealing with this terrible, terrible sense that death has touched his family, has touched his being, that death has touched his heart, he has this terrible betrayal that God introduces to him. It's his own mortality. Let's read this story. We're in chapter 20 of the book of Numbers, the second section of the book of Parsha Chukat. The Israelites arrived in a body at the wilderness of Zin on the first new moon, and the people stayed at Kadesh, and Miriam died there and was buried. Now, one of the things about Miriam is that Miriam occurs the name Miriam means the bitter waters, and Miriam, the bitter waters, refers, at least in most readings, to the waters of the womb, of amnio waters, of the waters in which we are all born into the world. Every time Miriam occurs, water's there. She's down by the river as Moses is floating down the river toward the daughter of Pharaoh. She is the singer at the sea. There is a well, according to the Midrash, the beautiful, imaginative, poetic telling of the rabbis, there is a well that follows Miriam through the world. And as soon as she dies, the well disappears. The community was without water. Miriam's gone and there's no water. And they joined against Moses and Aaron. The people quarreled with Moses, saying, if only we had perished when our brothers perished in the instance of the Lord. Why have you brought the Lord's congregation in the wilderness for us and our beasts to die here? Why did you make us leave Egypt to bring us to this wretched place with no grain or figs or wine or pomegranates? There's not even water to drink. Again, when Jews complain, they become wonderfully articulate. I mean, the soliloquies of complaint are one of the features of the book of Bamidbar. Moses and Aaron came away from the congregation to the entrance to the tent of meeting. They fell on their faces. The presence of the Lord appeared to them, and God said, you and your brother Aaron, take the rod, assemble the congregation before their very eyes, order the rock to yield its water, and you shall produce water for them from the rock, providing drink from the congregation and their beasts. So Moshe took the rod from before the Lord, as he commanded. Moses and Aaron assembled the congregation in front of the rock, and he said to them, listen, you rebels, shall we get water for you from this rock? And Moses raised his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and out came copious water, and everybody drank. But the Lord said, because you did not trust me enough to affirm my sanctity in the sight of the people Israel, therefore you shall not lead the congregation into the land that I have given them. I hate this section. I hate it because of all that Moses gave up to be the leader of the people, of all that Moses suffered to be the leader of the people. And every time I read this, every time we come around to the yearly cycle of this section, I always have this fantasy that I'm going to read it and it's going to end differently. Okay, you don't have to be the leader to lead the people into the land, but let him go and retire in Netanya and be one of the old guys on the boardwalk in Netanya playing chess and drinking espresso and talking about life in the old country. Why keep him out of the land? Why prevent him from seeing the resolution, the fulfillment of the dream? It's just not fair. And after all, what was the sin? Back in the book of Exodus, the same thing happened. The people complained there wasn't water. Moses was told to go to the rock with his rod and smack the rock. That was Exodus. Same story occurs here, but the instruction gets changed just enough. He's told, take the rod, but if you're not going to use the rod, why take the rod? Stand in front of the rock and talk to the rock. But Moses is sitting shiva for his sister. Moses is anguished, and he's older by now, and he's tired of listening to the complaints. And so he smacks the rock, and he makes the speech, listen, you rebels, shall we get water? So the Midrashim, of course, the commentators are all split. Was it because he actually hit the rock and disobeyed God? Was it because he said, we will get water, me and Aaron, and not God? Was it because he called the people rebels and didn't have patience to remember who they were, that they were his people and his responsibility? That's what all the Meforshim say. And you can see why each one of those is a reason why God would punish him, as it were, with this punishment. But those are trivial compared to what Moses has gone through, compared to what Moses has accomplished. No, that's not what it is. It's something much more fundamental. First of all, there's a practical reason. The founder, the prophet, the leader Moshe is not the person to take on the administrative responsibilities of bringing the people into the land and settling them there. He's the visionary. Visionaries have an important role in the creation of societies, but they become lousy administrators when you give them the tasks of government to actually do. Plato was wrong. Philosophers do not make good kings. Plato thought philosophers made good kings because they were self-aware and knew their own worst impulses. And that's true. But philosophers see visions. They're not good at the details. And more than that, philosophers want the absolute. They want the truth. They're not very good at the compromises that come with governing. If you've ever sat on a board, if you've ever been in a committee, if you've ever participated in any kind of collective decision-making, it's always about compromise. And the guy who sits at the end of the table grousing that it wasn't what it was supposed to be because it's not the absolute truth or the absolute perfection that he had envisioned or she had envisioned, well, he's right, she's right. That's the role of the prophet, but that's not going to get us there. Governing is always about making compromises. A budget is always a compromise between infinite tasks and finite resources. A litigation is always a compromise between what this one wants and what this one wants. It's always, a mediation is always that kind of compromise. And so Moses is practically not the person who should take the people in. But I think he should retire. That's my bid. There's a deeper truth to this. And the deeper truth is he's not going to see the promised land because any great idealist who dreams of something big never sees the promised land. Human life isn't long enough. And this is the truth of this Torah portion, that if you dream of something truly magnificent, truly big, you're not going to live long enough to see it happen. Maybe if you're truly blessed, your children or your children's children, or your successors, your students, your disciples, your friends, the community that you establish, they will enjoy the fruits of your labors. You'll see an inkling of it. Moses is allowed to climb the mountain, and from the Pisgah, from the mountain, he's able to see the promised land and imagine what it would look like as his people enter the land. That's the most an idealist can get. Most people don't understand this, and they embrace dreams that are too small. If you embrace a dream that you can fulfill in the course of your lifetime, then what? Then what do you do? Play golf? What? Nothing wrong with golf. Don't get insulted. But a great life embraces a great dream that transcends, that extends beyond the boundaries of one human lifetime. And that's the sort of ultimate built-in tragedy, the built-in tragedy of being a human being, that we're finite, and that we never, but our dreams are infinite. We're finite, our years are finite, our strength, our influence, our power is finite, but our visions, our ideals, our values are infinite. And that contradiction means that just like Moses, those of us who have embraced and fight for great, magnificent visions of the world, we won't get to see, we won't get to enjoy, we won't get to kfel over the fulfillment of our dreams. Very few people, very few great people see the fulfillment of their dreams. Much like Moses, they die before the dream is fulfilled, but they might, like Moses, have the idea that they can peek at it and know that those who come after them will get it. The task here is not the water, it's not the smacking of the rock or the castigating of the people as rebels. It's, excuse me, not the unfaithfulness of saying, we will get you the water. The problem here is human finitude, human mortality. And that's the problem. Now, we human beings, we have a fantasy. We have a fantasy that there's some way to overcome this, that there's some way to defeat that mortality. I want to live forever, says the song. I want to be famous. And if I'm famous, somehow they'll remember me when I'm gone. And when I'm famous, the ideals and dreams that matter so much to me, much less my own ego, will go on after me. And that brings us to the beginning of the Torah portion. The beginning of the Torah portion, it's called Chukat, because this is a law, a chok. And in Jewish law, the word chok means a law that can't be explained. There's certain rules in the Bible which are, the Bible itself explains them to us, tells us why they're important. And there's certain rules which is very clear why that rule exists. It's a moral law or even a ritual law that carries a symbolism that's powerful. But there are very few laws, and there are few of them in the Torah, where you're just told, do it. In fact, not only do it, but there's a certain absurdity to it. And here we have a law in which there's a certain quality of impenetrability. You can't understand what it means. An impenetrability, incomprehension is attached to this law, and we're just told to do it, to obey. Let's go back to chapter 19. God speaks to Moses and Aaron, says what? This is the chok. Zot chukat haTorah. This is the chok. Asher tziva Adonai lemor, that God's commanding you. Instruct the people of Israel to bring you a red cow, para aduma. Now, cows come in all colors, right? There's black ones, and there's white ones, and there's brown ones, but there's a certain quality of sort of a auburn, and that's what he's talking about, an auburn, sort of reddish cow, right? In which there is no defect and on which no yoke has been laid. It's got to be a sort of brand new cow and no defect. And according to the rabbinic tradition, what he means here is this cow is entirely red. And the rabbis say, well, how red does he have to be? And the rabbis say, not even 2 hairs of a different color. That's a very red cow. And you'll give it to Eleazar the priest, and it'll be taken outside the camp and slaughtered in his presence. And Eleazar will take some of the blood with his fingers and sprinkle it 7 times the front of the tent of meeting. And the cow will be burned in his sight. Its hide, flesh, and blood shall be burned, its dung included. And the priest will take cedar wood and hyssop and chrism up and throw it into the fire. And the priest will wash his garments and bathe his body, and after that may enter the camp, but he shall be impure until evening. Now here's the contradiction. The red cow stuff is going to be the solvent that dissolves impurity. Red cow stuff dissolves impurity. But the guy who burned up the cow, and you'll see in a moment, the guy that gathers the ashes and makes the solvent, he's impure. That's the contradiction. That's why it makes no sense. The priest shall wash his garments, bathe his body. After that, he's impure. He who performed the burning will wash his garments in water, bathe his body, be impure. A man who is pure shall gather up the ashes of the cow, deposit them outside the camp in a pure place, to be kept for the water of lustration. Lustration. What the heck is lustration? It means to turn that which is impure into that which is pure. Mein midah. Right? It is for purification. The purpose is to purify people. Now remember, in the world of the Beit HaMikdash, in the world of the tabernacle, if a person comes into contact with something that's dead, they are impure. So you have to go through a ritual to make you pure. Not pure, but it's rather qualified to participate in the ritual life of the community, in the sacrifice, right? And this is the permanent law. I'm continuing in chapter 19. He who touches the corpse of a human being will be impure 7 days. He'll purify himself with it on the 3rd day and the 7th day, and then be pure. If he fails to do it on the 3rd and 7th day, he shall not be pure. Whoever touches the corpse and does not purify himself defiles God's tabernacle, shall be cut off from Israel. Since the waters of lustration, that is the meinidah, the red cow water, the red cow goo, was not dashed on him, he remains impure, and it stays on him. If you touch a dead body, if you're in the presence of a dead body, you're not permitted to participate in the ritual life of the congregation for a week. And you have to go through a ritual, and the ritual is you get spritzed with this stuff. You get spritzed with red cow water, the ashes of the red cow that are dissolved in water. And that's what transforms you from a person who has been touched by death into a person who is prepared to participate in the rites of the tabernacle and the temple. Now, I want to share with you an observation that was given to me by my son Yonah, and I credit him with this. Some years ago, Yonah gave a drashat Beit Tshuva, and it was something that really was remarkable, and something that I had never thought of. And it changed the way that I read this text, so I give him credit. A cow is a very big beast. How many hairs on a cow? I don't know. A lot. Let's just posit a lot. Is it possible to have a cow that is entirely red, that has no 2 black or white hairs? Is it possible? And the answer is no, of course not. So why would the Torah tell us that we have to find this impossible cow, and only through this impossible cow can we dissolve the impurity or the change in status that comes with contact with death? Because that very impossibility is the lesson here. It's the Torah here. When we are in contact with death, we are changed. We feel differently about the world. We may become sad and depressed. We may become angry and resentful of the limitations placed upon human being. I'm sure you've had this experience. A person you love dearly has been lost. And you say to yourself, how is it possible that a life so well lived, so full with humor and love, that a soul filled with so much kindness and goodness and strength and vision and power can be contained in a vessel so fragile as a human body? God, you must have made a mistake. This soul was much too powerful for this body much too frail, much too fragile to hold a soul this remarkable. And that's the point. There's no way around that. If you think that there is a magic formula for escaping death, if you think that there's a magic formula that can suddenly wipe away the feelings we have when we come into contact with death, if you think that there's any easy, quick, and simple, instant way of cleansing away the change that comes to our souls because we've confronted death, well, says the Torah, there is. Go find a cow that's all red. Oh, you can't find that cow, can you? Well, because there is no way. Because to be in confrontation with death is to be a human being, to realize our mortality, to understand that not one of us has an infinite number of tomorrows, and that because of that, it is ours to dream big and to try with all of our might to accomplish the dreams of our souls, but to know that we're not going to see the end of them, to have that humility and that recognition. It means, on the one hand, to take seriously every single day that we're given, because we don't have an infinite number of tomorrows. Because if there's someone in the world you need to go say thank you to, or I'm sorry to, or I love you to, or we need to be friends and make up the argument to, you got to go do that now, because you don't know what tomorrow's going to bring. We don't have an infinite number of tomorrows. Today is the day that matters. And on the other hand, because I don't have an infinite number of tomorrows, I'm prepared to dream big and work hard, and then turn over to those who come after me, and turn over into the hands of God the ideals and the dreams and the projects that I hold so very dear. There's no other way, because there's no such thing as a cow that's all red. There's no cleanser, there's no solvent that wipes away death from the human condition. Now, there's one more piece of this which I think is just remarkable, and that's my friend Moses. And what does Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher, do? When Aaron dies, and Miriam dies, and the dream dies, and he is told that he's not going to enter into the land, he's not going to live in that land, he's not going to see the fulfillment of the dream. The dream is bigger than him. It's interesting that in the book of Deuteronomy, when he tells this story to the next generation, he says, Va'et Hanan, I complained to God. But not in this story. In this imagination, what happens is Moses goes forward. Look at chapter 20, verse 14. From Kadesh, Moses sent messengers. He continues the journey. He continues the journey. He moves forward. Talmud teaches in Pirkei Avot, Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor v'lo ata ben horin livatel mimena. You're not going to finish the work. No one who is great and has great dreams finishes the work. But that doesn't mean you quit. You move forward. And then you hand over to those who follow you, and you hand into the hands of God the task, and have faith that it will be completed after your own days. And Moses moves forward. One other thing about this particular text, which brings us to the next Torah portion, which is we're already at Edom, which means somewhere right here in this sort of white space at the end of the third Aliyah before the fourth Aliyah, at the end of the story of the waters of Meribah, the waters of conflict, and the beginning of the next section, the 40 years of the desert have passed. As if to say, this was the last one to die. Moses is still alive. Miriam is gone. The dream has been put on hold. He's not going to see the land. Aaron is the last one to die. The whole generation has died out. except for Caleb and Yoshua. And Aaron's the last one, because now that we're in Edom, we're back at the boundaries of Eretz Canaan. We are there at the boundaries. And that's the seam line that I mentioned earlier. As we turn the page from Parshat Chukat to Parshat Balak, the second of our double Torah portions today, we pass the seam line. We are now in the end stage of the journey. The 40 years of the desert have passed. The generation that left Egypt has died, except for Moses and Caleb and Joshua. And we are now entering into the boundary lands around Eretz Canaan for our final approach into Eretz Canaan. We're now entering into those last approaches. And what's happening is we're approaching the peoples who live on the boundaries. The peoples who live on the boundaries. Now, what's interesting is two things. Number one, the peoples who live on the boundaries of Eretz Canaan are our family. In chapter 20, verse 14, he's going to talk to Edom. Edom is Esav. Esav is our cousin, right? And Moses says, thus says your brother Israel. Literally, because Jacob was Esau's brother, right? You know the hardships that have befallen us. You know our ancestors went down to Egypt. We dwell in Egypt a long time. The Egyptians dealt harshly. We cried unto the Lord. Now we are in Kadesh, the town on the border of your territory. Allow us to cross your country. We will not pass through vineyards or fields. We'll not drink the water. We'll follow the King's Highway, El Camino Real, they call it here in California. We'll stay on the freeway. We won't get off, right? Turning neither left or right until we have crossed the territory. This is family. These are our family. Now, not only are they family, but there's an ethic of the desert. And the ethic of the desert is you give safe passage. You give a passage through your land if someone sues. What Moses has done in this is lodge a formal petition in a language that the king of Edom would have understood. Not only are we kin, but we are passing through your territory according to the tradition of the desert, and it is your obligation to give us safe passage through your territory. But the king of Edom says, no. All the kings of all the territories are going to say no. They're going to block our passage through their territory, which is both a violation of the family ethic and a violation of the ethic of the desert. And the Bible's not going to take this lying down. These peoples are going to be cursed. And that brings us to this next story, Moab. Now, Moab is actually also a kinsman. Remember, Moab is the descendant of Lot. And we come to the boundaries of Moab. And the curious thing about Parsha Balak is that the entire story takes place in Moab, and it takes place through the eyes of this other people. The narrative focus shifts. Up until now, the narrative focus has been on Moses, on the people Israel, from within the people Israel. Now we're going to get a story from a completely different place. Meanwhile, as they say in the movies, it's a completely different scene. And what's the story? Very quickly, the king of Moab is Balak, and Balak wakes up one morning and sees 2.5 million Israelites on his front lawn, and he's terrified. He's terrified because they have been marching through the desert, destroying other kingdoms. They destroyed 2 of the kings of the desert, Sihon and Og, and now they've come to his boundary, and they sue for safe passage, and he's terrified they're going to destroy him too. Now, here's the second thing that's so interesting. First is this passage through, and the idea that they're supposed to give a safe passage. But the second thing is, remember the spies? Remember Parshat Beshalach just a couple weeks ago? 12 spies, 12 scouts go into the land. They come out. They all say it's a land filled with milk and honey, but 10 of them say, Anakim, they're giants there. And we felt like grasshoppers, and that's how we looked in their eyes. We felt like bugs. We were nothing. We can't conquer this land. They are much too powerful for us. They are much too mighty for us. They are much too great for us. And now we take a peek at Israel. That's how we look to ourselves. But how did we look in the eyes of those we were passing by? They're terrified. Imagine that. we feel like we look like bugs. But now the Torah discloses to us that in their eyes, they're terrified. In their eyes, we look like giants. We are these mighty desert warriors coming across the desert, invulnerable, unstoppable, irresistible. That's what the story is. So very quickly, the story is it's a wonderful folk tale inserted here in the Bible because it forms a buffer between the story of the human wilderness that ends in Chukat and the story of the approach and the beginning of the tasks of conquest and settlement that is going to fill the next chapters of the book of Bamidbar. And what's the story? Balak knows he can't stop us militarily, can't stop the Israelites militarily, so he calls in a ringer. And the ringer is the wizard Bilam. And the Bible acknowledges that Bilam has power because Bilam, even though he's not Jewish, Bilam has a relationship with God. And Bilam can curse people or bless people because God has put that power in him. Well, Balak wants to hire him. And Balak the king hires Bilam to come and curse the people of Israel. And Bilam keeps demanding, keeps insisting that I can only curse those that God curses, and I can only bless those whom God blesses. And Balak doesn't want to hear that. And what's happening here is what's as our first story about our contact with the people who border our homeland is a cultural perspective, rather a perspective on culture. We have here the confrontation of two religious worldviews. We have a worldview of the pagan world, which imagines the world governed by all of these magical forces of gods who can be manipulated with magical incantation, with magical spells, with magical potions. And the world of Israelite monotheism, in which God is a moral actor who cannot be manipulated. And these two ideas, the pagan idea that you can manipulate the gods who govern the powers of the gods who manipulate who govern our world, and monotheism's idea that God can't be manipulated, that magic doesn't happen in the world. If magic means that I can manipulate the world, abracadabra, and create things and destroy things just as I will it by manipulating the world, that's not true. This is a world governed by a moral God. And the only way to affect the destiny of the world is through your own morality, your own behavior, because God is a moral actor, not through manipulations of potions, not through manipulations of spells or magic wands or magic tricks. And so this confrontation between Balak's worldview and Bilam's knowledge of who God really is the beginning of the story of how we're going to live among other peoples who see the world and see God very, very differently than we do. And the denouement, the upshot of the story, the climax of the story, of course, is that hired to curse the people of Israel, Bilam ends up blessing them because he can only do what God wants him to do. He really does have no power. He really can't manipulate the gods. He really can't bring down curses from heaven. All he can do is be a vessel for God's moral insistence that the world needs to be the way God wants it to be. And what does God want in this case? God wants this covenanted people to be blessed. And so he stands on the mountaintop, and instead of cursing the people of Israel, he pronounces the words, Matovu ahalecha Yaakov, Mishkenotecha Yisrael, how goodly are your tents and your dwelling places, Israel, infuriates Balak, but keeps insisting, you just don't understand how the world works. This confrontation between the pagan world of magic and the monotheistic world of morality is going to characterize the rest of the Bible and, frankly, the rest of our history. I want to take a moment as we conclude our Torah study today to recognize the fact that today is July 4th, which is a powerful day. I know that it's celebrated in America typically with fireworks and concerts in the park, and we won't be able to do that this year, barbecues and families. But there's actually something very serious about this. I'm a Jew. I'm a Jew who has grown up and spent his entire life in America. I'm a Jew who understands the gift that America has been to the Jewish people. I represent something remarkable in Jewish history. I am the first generation in Jewish history not to fear a knock at the door in the middle of the night, or at least the first Jew in the diaspora history of the Jewish people. I was raised by immigrant parents, immigrant grandparents, parents who were immigrants to America as well. I was raised by people who knew the history of the Jewish people from within. There were survivors in our family. There were immigrants who told stories of pogroms and discrimination. My parents knew experiences of struggle and anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism certainly hasn't gone away, but it hasn't been a factor that's affected my life or the life of my children. We have found a place in America, a remarkable, remarkable place in America. Not to denigrate for a minute Zionism and the creation of the state of Israel, which is the greatest miracle in modern Jewish history, without a doubt. And I've been fortunate in my life to live in Israel for some years, to study there and to teach there and to be part of Israel's life. But there's no place, even with Israel as the miracle, there's no place like America has been to the Jewish people. I mean, just imagine for a moment, for all of the fear that we experienced in the course of our years, that in the last election, both candidates, both Mrs. Secretary Clinton and Mr. Trump, President Trump, had children who were married to Jews, and that wasn't an issue. That Joe Lieberman ran for vice president, and if anything, his Jewishness was a plus. It showed that he was a man of integrity and morality, that Jews have achieved so much in this country, but most of all, we found a place, a safety, a place where we can contribute our moral vision, our vision of ethics, our vision of the sacred society to American culture, and our talents and abilities to American commerce and to American culture. That's quite remarkable. The American story of coming to this continent and settling here matches the Jewish story. And so we feel at home here in a way we felt at home in very few places in the diaspora, in almost any place in the diaspora. So let's take a moment and recite some sacred words. If you would, I hope that you have these words handy somewhere in your existence. This is the Declaration of Independence, passed unanimously this day in 1776. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another and assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires they should declare the causes which impel them to this separation. And the declaration begins with a statement. And it's remarkable among the statements of nationhood around the world, around the globe, because it doesn't begin by saying, we are one nation that speaks one language, that worships God in one way. We are one nation bound together by ethnicity and blood. No, it doesn't say that at all. It says something quite beautiful and remarkable. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It begins with a universal statement of the human condition. In other words, America begins not with an ethnicity, with a nationhood. It begins with an idea. And the idea is that we are created equal. We are possessed of inalienable rights given to us by a Creator, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that all people are entitled to this. And this is the foundational idea of our society, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just and power from the consent of the governed. That government is not handed down from on high. It's not an absolute divine right. It's an agreement we came to about an efficient way to organize the society so that every one of us, to the extent that is entirely humanly possible, can enjoy the rights that are inalienable, those rights given to us by God. And that whenever a form of government is destructive, it is the right of the people to alter and abolish it and institute a new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. This is the wonderful gift of America. And as a Jew who has enjoyed the freedom of America, who has cherished the opportunity to raise children in this society, to become educated in this society, to share family and fortune in this society, today we give thanks. It wasn't easy to pronounce those words. It wasn't easy to throw off the rule of a king you had grown up with, a king who you'd been taught since you were a child had a divine right to rule. It wasn't easy to face down the mighty army and navy of the British Empire. It was dangerous. It was frightening. It was a fearsome thing. And yet a group of men, and by extension women, of course, said that and created this wonderful democracy. And today we give thanks for their courage, their wisdom, their vision, and their lives. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shechianu v'kimanu v'gianu lazman hazeh. May God bless this country, its people, its government, its citizens, with those inalienable rights and the courage to always stand for them, to fight for them, to protect them, and to share them with one another. Have a very good Shabbos today. Following our Torah study, of course, is davening, Shabbos morning davening, and then some few words from Rabbi Hillel Silverman on this week's Parsha. Stay well.